a lion, and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. Now, most people agree this goes right along with the beginning of the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, and this is Babylon itself. Interestingly enough, the symbol of Babylon, exactly what we see here. A lion with eagle's wings. That was always the symbol of ancient Babylon. Right before, during the War on Terror, that Saddam Hussein was killed and all that took place over in the Middle East, he was, not so secretly, but not a lot of people put any stock into it, he was attempting to revive the kingdom of Babylon. Do you know what symbol he had everywhere? A lion with eagle's wings. That is the symbol and symbolic of Babylon. And if you'll notice here that it talks about that he was lifted up from the earth and made to stand upon feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. If you'll remember, again, the greatest king during the time of Babylon is Nebuchadnezzar. We went through just a couple of chapters ago. Nebuchadnezzar, on up in age, when he just got too proud of himself and so full of himself and who he was and what he was, God struck him down. He went into the beast's field. He grew feathers like a fowl and ate of the grass and laid in the dew for 7 years. And then at the end of that 7 years, he stood up, came out of that. And if you remember, when we talked about that, it said that he gave credit and praise and glory to the one true God, Jehovah God. And in his words and how he says it, we feel like he believed in God and was saved. And so you see here in this vision and dream that Daniel has, it said that a man's heart was given to it. This beast's heart was changed. We know that according to Scripture and what Daniel said, Nebuchadnezzar's heart was changed. So we feel like that coincides right along with Babylon and that head of gold. Then we get to the second beast. Verse 5, and behold another beast, a second, like to a bear. Notice, I think we said this the other night, it doesn't say it is a bear or it is a lion, but it says it's like a bear. So we're not quite sure maybe what Daniel means. Maybe that's just what the form looks like or what. But it says like to a bear. And it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, arise, devour much flesh. So we got a bear. When you think about a bear, I know our Gatlinburg folks got to see some bears last week. Bears, even though they can be fast, and if you ever see one that's running fast or chasing, it can be. But we kind of think of a bear as kind of being big and lumbering and just powerful. Jaws powerful to crush things, just brute strength and power. Well, when you're looking at Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel 2, as you moved down into that silver, this represented the same thing as this second one did. And we get the Medo-Persian Empire led by Darius, which again, Daniel's going to last unto. But remember, as this vision starts, we're back out of chronological order. The Medes and Persians have not taken over Babylon yet. Belshazzar is still the king of Babylon, so that hasn't taken place. So it's not like Daniel's looking back now. For these next few things, these will be things that haven't happened up until this time. Now we know from Daniel chapter 6 that Cyrus, Darius are in charge with the Medes and the Persians, and they've taken over. We know that's how what happens with Daniel being put in the lion's den. But at the time of this dream and vision, that had not happened. Interestingly enough, the Medes and Persians got their strength out of just pure size and numbers. They were a huge army. They were the first army to kind of break into regiments. Before the Medes and Persians come along, you just had a bunch of men, you just sent them out to fight. You just kind of won with numbers or with strength. But the Medes and the Persians were the first ones to kind of put some organization to it. You know, they had the spearmen over here and the bowmen over here and this kind of people here. And they broke them up and they set up them in ranks and they were just a huge, strong army that just kind of lumbered through the country and the region and just crushed other nations by force, much like what a bear would do. Now, in the second chapter, in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, it just gives us the silver and describes it. But in this, we get a little bit more depth. We get this bear, but we get 3 ribs sticking out of his mouth. And when the Medes and Persians took over the world empire, there were 3 main kingdoms that they subdued or crushed. And the biggest ones at the time were Libya, Egypt, and Babylon. They all got crushed by the Medes and Persians. Again, that's why Daniel ends up changing in the government and becoming under someone else's rule, because the Babylonians are destroyed and the Medes and Persians take over. So most people believe that those 3 ribs would be those 3 kingdoms. Again, Libya, Egypt, and Babylon. Verse 6 brings us to the 3rd beast. And after this I beheld, and in another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. So now we're going to go from a bear to a leopard. And if you think about the characteristics of those 2 animals, we're going to go from something that seemingly is big and strong and lumbering to something that's really fast and quick. And again, as we move down in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, what we're moving into is the 3rd empire that would conquer the Medes and Persians and conquer the world, and that is Greece under Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great's army was a smaller army. It wasn't huge like the Medo-Persians, but they were known for being quick and fast and moving and being able to maneuver and move their army at a moment's notice. And people would think, other countries might think they had them pinned down. Next thing you know, they're not even there. They're coming from behind you and they're destroying you. So again, we can kind of see where that picture's like a leopard. You go, well, Daniel just looked back in history and saw that. No, again, this hasn't happened yet. Daniel is now seeing things that are going to happen in the future. So we got the leopard. But what's the deal with the 4 wings and the 4 heads? Well, if you study a little bit or look at Alexander the Great, he conquers the whole world by the age of 29. Y'all know he's 29-year-old who even conquered their house ships, you know? He conquered the world. And at 29, he was bored. There's nothing left to do. There's nothing left to conquer. So he had done everything that he wanted to do. And he didn't live much longer. Some historians say he was 32 when he died. Some say he was 33 when he died. Conquered the world by 29, gone by 32 or 33. The problem was he was in control of the entire world. And he didn't leave a will, and he didn't leave people behind to take over. And even on his deathbed, as they asked him, well, who's going to be in charge now? He said, the strong will survive. The strong will take over. He didn't even leave it behind. And so once he dies, that whole empire of the world, basically, of Greece, who's in charge of everything, got split into, guess how many regions? 4. 4 feathers, 4 heads, 4 regions of what was known of the world at that time, split into 4. So again, we could see that those 4 regions or 4 divisions in the kingdom fell under 4 generals, and that will actually come up later on as we get a little bit further into the prophecy of Daniel. So that brings us to the final. And after this, verse 7, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible. Notice he doesn't say what it looks like. This is kind of where you might say that he really didn't know exactly what he was looking at, and he was having to try to describe it according to an animal. Because he can't even give a description of this last one, only that it was dreadful, terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces and stamped the residue with the feet of it, and it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Well, The iron teeth, again, would coincide with chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, as we got down to the legs of iron. If you remember, we did that. It's the fourth last great kingdom or empire of the world that would be, and that is Rome. Rome was the iron fist. The Romans were the first to really use iron in making their weapons and making their tools and becoming an expert at using it and using it to their advantage. Iron always coincided with Rome. You'll notice that in Daniel's vision and dream, there were 10 horns. In Nebuchadnezzar's dream, you had legs of iron and you had feet that had 10 toes of iron and sand, which, as we talked about back then, really don't mix very well. And so here we have the last beast. Can't describe it, just that it's exceedingly great and terrible, but it does have iron teeth and it has 10 horns. Verse 8 says, "And I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn there were eyes like the eyes of man, and a mouth speaking great things." Well, we're moving now into further prophecy. You know, what happened to the Roman Empire? Who conquered the Roman Empire? Nobody did. They ate themselves up. They just basically dissipated under the pressure of how great the empire was, and it finally just folded. Nobody ever defeated the Romans. And from that time, all the way up till now, there still has never been a great, true world empire. There's been some attempts at it. Hitler was attempting that, but he's defeated. There's been some attempts, but nobody's had the power that Rome had, or the power that Greece had, or even back that the Medo-Persians had, or that the Babylonians had. So it's the last one. And at the end, we know, according to prophecy and what's going to happen, there's going to be that Confederation of Nations. We alluded to it back when we were in Ezekiel, looking at the Gog-Magog war, and looking at the war that's to come at the end of the world. There will be a Confederation of Nations that most people agree coincides with both the 10 toes in Nebuchadnezzar's dream and the 10 horns here of Daniel's dream and vision. 10 kings, 10 nations. Where are they going to come from? Come out of what used to be the old Roman Empire, out of modern day Europe, out of what is now been built, the European Union. When the EU first came, it had 10 stars as its symbol. Now it's up to 12 stars, and there's a lot more than that countries that have signed on and become a part of it. But as things change and things happen, we see how easily that 10 nations could become the dominant nations out of it and be that. Because you've got things like right now, you know, over the last few years, you've seen Great Britain, they're getting out of it. The Brexit, Britain's exit out of the EU. And so as things change and things line up, we can see how it's a possibility that 10 strong nations out of the EU could be the 10 toes, or could be the 10 horns. We talked about this back when we looked at the 10 toes. They were a combination now of not just iron like the Roman Empire, but sand. Sand like the desert sand. Sand like the Arabs come from and live in. And as we talked about, if you watch the news, a lot of European countries are being overrun and overtaken by Muslims, by Arabs who have come in and changed the look of that country. England is that way now. Germany is that way now. France is coming that way now. Every time you see some kind of terrorist activity or something happen in Europe, it's usually because there's some kind of Muslim uprising, some kind of Arab problem that manifests itself in some kind of attack or some kind of terrorist activity. They're not mixing very well with the old European people who have been there and established the country, just like iron and sand don't mix. So we can see now again that is where these beasts come from and who they might represent. Now, the question comes, well, how come it stops there? Why did Nebuchadnezzar's dream stop with Rome? And why does Daniel's dream and vision stop with Rome? I mean, that's, almost 2,000 years ago when the Roman Empire finally does dissipate and everybody becomes their own nation again. And so, why don't we see anything else? Well, I'll remind you of this. Prophecy is always tied to God's people. We talked about this on that Wednesday night. Up until recent history, and I say recent, the last 70 years, Israel was not a nation anymore. When Rome destroys Jerusalem in 70 A.D. and scatters the Jews, there was never a Jewish nation. Even your greatest biblical scholars, Martin Luther, John Calvin, when they wrote 500 years ago, they couldn't quite understand the role of what prophecy would be because it keeps talking about a nation of Israel. And 500 years ago, it had been 1,500 years since there had been Israel, and there didn't look like there was ever going to be another nation of Israel. But we know that in 1948, Israel becomes a nation again, and doesn't just become a nation, but becomes one of the strongest, most powerful nations, even today, in the world. And so, as prophecy is tied to that, when Rome destroys Israel and destroys Jerusalem and scatters the Jews, it's almost as if prophecy's kind of on a stopwatch, and that stopwatch stops. And it doesn't pick up again until we get to the end. So what's in between there? Well, what did Jesus Christ bring in? He brought in the church age. When he dies, when he's raised again, and he sends out the apostles, and they began building his church. Gentiles are grafted in. That age begins. And it's been going on now for almost 2,000 years. God's age of grace. Again, you can get real deep off into this stuff, but for people who, some people believe it, some people don't, in dispensationalism, the dispensation of God throughout time, that's where we're at in dispensation times. If you read in the New Testament, it talks about the dispensation and the fullness of the Gentiles has come. Well, that dispensation would end and the fullness of the Gentiles come when the Lord comes back and takes the church out, which is the rapture. So when he comes out and in the rapture and takes us out, then we'll pick back up with the timeline of prophecy again. And as we get further into Daniel, we talk about the 70 weeks. The 69 weeks have happened. And Jesus died and was raised again. And that time period stopped. And that 70th week doesn't come. And again, remember that week is not 7 days, but 7 years until the end of the fullness of the Gentiles and the rapture of the church takes place. And then that last 7 years begins the time period we know of as the Great Tribulation. So again, I hope I haven't got too far off on that, but just kind of remind you that that's kind of why it has stopped, per se, and we've kind of got that gap here. But in verse 8, after he talks about the 10 horns, he talks about the little horn. The little horn. We'll get further at the end of this chapter, we'll know that the little horn is the Antichrist. But then we change views or change settings or change location, however you want to refer to it. Starting in verse 9, I'm just going to read 9 through 14 as a group. And I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool, and his throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The judgment was set, and the books were opened. And I beheld them because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake. I beheld even till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed, and given to the burning flame. As concerning the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and time. And I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom, which shall not be destroyed. What we see now is the end. We see the final judgment. We see the beast cast into the lake of fire. What we're seeing is Revelation, according to what Daniel saw, well before what John ever saw in Revelation. You say, well, it does kind of sound familiar. Well, let's see just how familiar. Brad, I'm going to go off course. Will you go to Revelation chapter 19, verse 19? Now think about what we just read in 9 through 14, and then in Revelation 19:19. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse and against his army. And the beast was taken, with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into a lake of fire, burning with brimstone. And the remnant were slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which sword proceeded out of his mouth, and all the fowls were filled with their flesh. Sounds kind of familiar. Sounds kind of like it's just like what Daniel is seeing here in verses 9 through 14 of chapter 7. We see Jesus coming. We see the judgment. We see the beast cast into the lake of fire. We see Jesus take over, have dominion and power. So back to the text, Brad, to verse 15. Notice what it does to Daniel. I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit in the midst of my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. I came near unto one of them that stood by, and asked him the truth of all this. So he told me, and made me know the interpretation of the things. These great beasts, which are four kings, which shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom, and possess the kingdom forever, even forever and ever. Then I would know the truth of the fourth beast, which diverse from all the others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron, and his nails of brass, which devoured, brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet. And of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, the little horn, and before whom 3 fell, even of that horn that had eyes and a mouth that spake very great things, whose look was more stout than his fellows. I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints, and prevailed against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. Again, the Antichrist and his rise. And then the end, when Jesus comes back with all the saints who have been in heaven during the tribulation, at the judgment seat of Christ, the marriage supper of the Lamb, and we come back, remember, and we rule and reign with Christ. We don't know what our jobs are going to be. We don't know how that's going to look or work out, but we know that the Bible's clear that that's what's going to happen when the Lord comes back. Verse 23 says, Thus he said, The fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak great words against the Most High. So again, we've got the Antichrist. Now Daniel gives us this vision of out of the 10 kings or the 10 nations that arise out of the old Roman Empire. Now when the Antichrist comes, remember, he'll come to power through a peace treaty with Israel and all its neighbors that's trying to destroy it. But somewhere in that time, 3 of those nations will find themselves in conflict with the Antichrist, and he will have them destroyed. But we have this little horn, the Antichrist, and we get a list of the things he's going to do starting there in verse 25. He shall speak great words against the Most High. Well, that's common sense. He's anti-Christ. He is against God. He is against Jesus. So yes, he will be speaking out. Now remember, he is in control because of the peace treaty that he arranges between Israel and all its neighbors. And all the world that's just been clamoring for this peace just sees him as this great, wonderful hero. And everybody is under his spell. But remember, we're not going to be here. We would know who he was, but we're going to be gone. But all those that are left will be under his spell, under his control. They'll just think he's just the greatest thing ever. And so when he begins to say things against God and things against Jesus, they fall right in line. That's not hard for us to understand. I mean, really, that's happening now. Even with us here. Even with the church still here. It's not hard to find people who will stand up and blaspheme the name of God. No. Who will stand up and blaspheme the name of Jesus. Who will tell you and me that we're idiots for believing in God and Jesus. So can you imagine when the Holy Spirit's gone and all that are really saved and Christians are gone, how easy that will be for folks to listen to this Antichrist speak against God and think nothing of it. Verse 25, I like this. Shall wear out the saints of the Most High. You've been worn out before. Mama wore me out a few times in my life. He's going to be wearing out the saints. Well, preacher, you said, we'd be gone. Well, remember, we are gone. But life goes on. There will still be the Word. There will still be opportunities. There will still be people who at this time have not taken the mark of the beast. And so those people will be being worn out by the Antichrist. And this third one, people, I didn't understand what this meant, but we can see it today. Think about it. And think to change times and laws. All right, we can see the law thing right now. What are we going through in the greatest country that was based on a belief in God? Get rid of the police. Get rid of the laws. Let all the folks out of prison. We all racist. Get them out. Get them out. Get them out. Get them out. Change the law. That's not hard to understand. That once the Antichrist is in control, that'd be easy to do. What's the thing about changing the dates? Well, it's common sense. Think about it. Who's the last person to come along that changed dates? Jesus Christ. When Jesus came, this whole world was affected. And history began to be numbered with before his birth and after his birth. So even if you say you don't believe God or you don't believe Jesus, if you get asked what year it is, you always say, well, it's 2021. Well, if it's 2021, where'd you get that number from? Well, that's after the birth of Christ. Well, you said there is no Christ. So really, according to your thoughts, we're like year 23,479,623,408. How you gonna say it's 2021 if you don't believe? Now, could you see where the Antichrist will say, y'all been putting this year in like this all this time, and y'all know there was never a Christ and there's not a God, so we're going to quit using that date, we're going to start using my dates. Change the dates, change the laws. Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because again, he's anti-Christ. And remember, as we'll get to further in Daniel, in the middle here, he's going to go in and set himself up as God. Again, this is not in the Bible, and I ain't saying it, but I could see him saying, hey, when he sets himself up as God at the 3.5-year part of the tribulation, he can say, hey, time is starting over. We in year 1 right now. That would make sense. The Bible doesn't say that's what it is, but it does say he's going to change the times, and he's going to change the laws. Continuing there with what he will do. and they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time. We talked about this earlier in Daniel. All right, so that corresponds with years. So we say a time, that's 1 year. So we got a time. And times, plural, that's 2 years. And the dividing of time, or dividing of something straight down the middle, divide in half. So half a year. What is 1 plus 2 plus a half? 3 and a half. Tribulation is split into the first 3.5 years of peace, of everybody under his spell, and then the abomination of desolation, where he will set himself up as God in the temple. And then you have the last 3.5 years where everything will just get worse and worse, and even more worse than anybody could imagine what it's been like in the first 3.5. So Daniel sees this time period and in his vision and dream, and that's what he writes down. Time, times, and the dividing of time. Verse 26. But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy unto the end. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Again, Jesus in control, and the saints who come back with him, ruling and reigning. And then the last verse, hitherto is the end of the matter. That's the end of the dream and vision that Daniel had as he's written it down. And as for me, Daniel, my cogitations much troubled me, and my countenance changed in me. But I kept the matter in my heart. You'll notice as we get further into these dreams and visions and the prophecy that Daniel will give, it troubles him more and more, and his response will be stronger and stronger. But for the end of this dream and vision that he had in the first year of Belshazzar's reign of Babylon, he said that it disturbed him and his countenance changed. But he just kept these things in his heart. He didn't tell anybody. He didn't make a deal of it. He just kept them to himself and wrote them down. And how about 2,500 years later, almost 2,600 years later, we'd be sitting here reading this dream and vision as it's written out in Shannon Baptist Church, waiting on the trumpet. Amen. Wednesday night, Lord willing, we'll get into chapter 8 of Daniel 7. Let's stand. We do want to have a verse of invitation. Sure is good to have Charlie and Sandra sitting in their spot with the sun not being out. We're glad to have them back in Shannon where they can be with us at night. Sandra, come and play while Brad leads us in a verse of invitation.